It was supposed to be just another ordinary day at a high school in small-town Georgia, but what followed was a series of events so disturbing, so full of contradictions and silence, that to this day, no one has been able to clearly explain what really happened. A hidden body, an empty gym, corrupted footage, and a grief that never got answers. Kendrick Johnson was just a teenager, but his death became one of the most mysterious and controversial cases in the United States, raising suspicions of negligence, racism, and a massive cover-up. What happened inside Lowndes High School that afternoon still echoes like a haunting whisper through the old gym's walls. You're about to hear a dark and detailed account of the Kendrick Johnson case, the young man found dead, rolled up in a gym mat. With every part of this story, you'll dive deeper into layers of tension, ignored clues, and a possible crime that refuses to be forgotten. But be warned, the deeper you go, the more disturbing it gets. And the question that's haunted this case since 2013 still echoes. Did Kendrick fall, or was he pushed? Welcome to Urban Hauntings. Here we dive into mysteries, paranormal events, and true crime stories, always with a deep, immersive approach. If you're into this kind of content, help support the channel. Like the video, share your theories in the comments, send it to someone who also loves the supernatural and true crime, and hit that subscribe button with the bell on. Your support makes all the difference and helps us grow. Now let's get into today's story. Kendrick Johnson was born on October 10, 1995, in Valdosta, Georgia. From a young age, his presence stood out, whether for his charisma, athletic talent, or sharp mind for math and science. He was a student at Lowndes High School, where he quickly became known as a rising star in sports. His dream was to become a professional football player, and it wasn't hard to believe he could make it. His physical strength and discipline always put him one step ahead. His parents, Jacqueline and Kenneth Johnson, described Kendrick as a respectful, well-mannered young man who loved life. Always smiling, he seemed to carry an endless energy. He had many friends, but also knew how to enjoy solitude, to reflect, study, or train. Kendrick was both determined and reserved. To his family, he wasn't just a son. He was hope, future, pride. But that light was brutally extinguished, leaving behind questions that still echo in the silence. At school, it was common to see him running down the halls, a sneaker in his hand, a grin on his face, and his eyes set firmly on a promising future. But behind that energy, there were unspoken tensions. According to later reports, Kendrick had been involved in conflicts with other students, particularly with a white student who had allegedly bullied and assaulted him for over a year. Some of these incidents were reportedly witnessed by coaches and school staff. Yet the administration, according to later claims, chose to ignore the warnings. On the morning of January 10, 2013, Kendrick left for school like he always did. His face was the same, confident, focused, unaware that he was about to vanish. He attended classes, participated in activities, and was last seen in the early afternoon entering the school's old gym. After that, silence. No clear footage. No return. Kendrick simply disappeared, in the middle of the school day, in a building with hundreds of students and dozens of security cameras. What could happen to a student inside their own school? What didn't the cameras show? And why were so many people silent for so long? Kendrick Johnson's disappearance was just the first act of a story that would send his family into a nightmare of pain, mistrust, and a desperate search for justice. What started as a simple absence would evolve into one of the most controversial and heartbreaking stories in the United States. It was supposed to be just another Thursday at Lowndes High School in Valdosta. Kendrick stayed after class, something he'd done many times before, probably to train in the old gym. But on the afternoon of January 10, 2013, he was never seen leaving the building. When he didn't come home, his mother, Jacqueline, immediately knew something was wrong. At exactly 12:30 a.m., she reported him missing. The next morning, the school's routine was shattered by a horrifying discovery. A group of students climbed to the top of a stack of large gym mats rolled up vertically in the corner of the old gym. There, inside one of the mats, about 6 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, they found Kendrick's body. He was upside down, one arm stretched above his head, the other down at his side, already in an advanced stage of decomposition. The smell was overpowering. The image was inhuman. His face was swollen, bloodied, unrecognizable. The psychological impact was immediate, for those who saw it, and even more for those who had to accept it. The news spread quickly through the school, but the answers didn't come. How could a 17-year-old, healthy, athletic student end up dead inside a school mat, without anyone noticing? How could his body go undiscovered for nearly 24 hours? The initial version from authorities came quickly, and definitively, Kendrick had fallen into the mat while trying to retrieve a pair of sneakers he shared with a friend. It was, according to them, a freak accident. 3 students claimed that storing shoes in the mats was common, but even that explanation didn't seem to fit reality. Kendrick was athletic, flexible, and strong. His shoulders measured 19 inches, while the opening of the mat was only 14 inches, and one of the shoes was found underneath his body, while the other was beside his head. And so began the true descent into the darkness of this case. A death surrounded by missing footage, blood in strange places, conflicting testimonies, and a school that strangely continued operating as if nothing had happened. But the cry for answers was just beginning. Just hours after Kendrick Johnson's body was discovered, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation. But to the shock of many, their preliminary conclusion came almost immediately. Investigators claimed it was an accident, death by positional asphyxia. Kendrick, they said, had fallen into the mat trying to retrieve a shoe, and died because he couldn't get out. According to police, the case was closed. Just like that. The problem? Nothing about it was simple. None of it made sense. The way his body was found didn't align with an accidental death. The positioning of his arms, the absence of defensive marks, the condition of the scene, everything pointed to something else. And even more suspicious, Kendrick had no shoes on, but one sneaker was underneath his body, and the other right next to his head. How does someone reach for something that's already beneath them? The official autopsy, conducted by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, supported the accident theory, ruling the cause of death as positional asphyxia. But Kendrick's parents weren't buying it. The police version felt way too convenient, almost rehearsed. Investigator Stride Jones stated, "There has never been any credible information that indicates this was anything other than an accident." Words that sounded like a cold sentence, but failed to answer even the most basic questions. Kendrick's own habits contradicted the official theory. He was agile, strong, familiar with the mats, and knew how to move around them. Close friends confirmed he never crawled fully inside the mats. He would toss the shoes in from the top. He never climbed in himself, and even if he had fallen, his strength and flexibility would likely have helped him get out. The police version ignored all of that. It also ignored the blood on the walls, the delay in the arrival of the medical examiner, and the fact that the body had been moved before the official report was written. While the official story settled into the label of accident, Kendrick's parents began to see a very different picture forming. A picture of haste, disregard, and maybe even a cover-up. Was someone trying to hide something? Who would want to bury this case under the cold weight of a technical report? The school's silence and the speed of the investigation only fueled what would soon explode into national outrage. Kendrick's body hadn't even cooled before the crime scene was already compromised. The coroner was called 6 hours late, violating basic crime scene protocols. By the time he arrived, the scene had been disturbed. Kendrick's body had been moved, objects had been touched, and students were still walking freely through the area. A suspicious death inside a school, treated like routine. But what investigators found, and ignored, was even more alarming. Bloodstains were discovered nearly 50 feet away from where Kendrick's body was found, and that blood wasn't his. Still, the sample was never properly tested. A backpack, a hoodie with stains, and a pair of blood-covered sneakers were also found in the gym. None of it was collected as evidence. It was just left there. The authorities' justification? According to them, irregularities didn't necessarily mean evidence, but Kendrick's parents saw it differently. A collection of omissions that, when put together, formed a disturbing pattern. Bloody footprints near the mat weren't photographed. Witnesses weren't thoroughly questioned. And most importantly, there was no coherent explanation for the stained items. That's when the family's trust turned into outrage. They hired an independent forensic pathologist, Dr. William R. Anderson, to conduct a second autopsy. The result was a punch to the gut, blunt force trauma to the right side of the neck, damage to soft tissues. Anderson dismissed the idea of an accident. To him, the cause of death was clear. Kendrick had been attacked. Kendrick had been murdered. These findings shined a light on a possible cover-up. With each new detail, the feeling grew stronger, that the truth was being hidden, that the crime scene hadn't been mishandled out of incompetence, but on purpose. The line between human error and deliberate manipulation was beginning to blur, and the Kendrick Johnson case was no longer an unexplained accident. It was becoming a real-life nightmare. 6 months after Kendrick's death, his family made a painful but necessary decision. They requested an exhumation. They no longer trusted anyone. Not the school, not the police, not the state authorities. The official autopsy claimed Kendrick had died from positional asphyxia, but something in Jacqueline Johnson's heart told her otherwise. And she was right. On June 15, 2013, Kendrick's body was exhumed and examined again by Dr. William R. Anderson, a forensic pathologist from Florida. But when he opened the body, he found something shocking: a literal emptiness. Kendrick's internal organs had been removed, and in their place, newspaper. Yes, crumpled newspaper stuffed into his chest cavity, where his heart, lungs, and brain should have been. The shock was devastating. How do a person's organs simply vanish after an autopsy? The state coroner claimed that Kendrick's organs had been destroyed by natural decomposition and discarded before the body was released to the funeral home. But that explanation bordered on absurd. The funeral home responded by saying they received the body in that condition, and that filling the torso with newspaper was a common way to preserve shape. But Dr. Anderson found something far more important than the newspaper: clear signs of blunt force trauma to the neck and soft tissue. Injuries that, in his expert opinion, were not consistent with falling into a rolled-up mat. Not remotely. The wounds pointed to violence, to assault, to homicide. His report was conclusive. This death was not accidental. The second autopsy didn't bring peace. It brought outrage. What should have been a thorough and professional process had become a symbol of carelessness, negligence, and possibly cover-up. How can anyone trust an investigation that begins with a mutilated, emptied, and tampered with body? From that moment forward, the Johnson family's narrative changed forever. Kendrick didn't die. Kendrick was killed. If there's one thing that should provide answers in a modern school setting, it's security cameras. But in Kendrick Johnson's case, the 35 surveillance cameras spread across the Lowndes High School campus only raised more questions. In November 2013, after intense public pressure, nearly 290 hours of footage were finally released to the media. What they showed was alarming. Forensic video experts found large chunks of missing time on several cameras. On one of them, an hour and 5 minutes had vanished. On another, 2 hours and 10 minutes were gone. According to later statements, the systems weren't properly synced. The timestamps varied by up to 20 minutes between cameras. That created confusion, but also suspicion. Had someone edited the footage? The area where Kendrick's body was found, the gym mats, had zero camera coverage. None. Kendrick was last seen entering the gym at 1:28 p.m. After that, nothing. No footage showed him leaving. No other camera angle caught his movements. He went in and never came out. A digital disappearance in broad daylight. Authorities claimed the missing footage was due to motion-triggered cameras. If no pixels changed, the system didn't record. But to many, that sounded like a technical smokescreen, an explanation meant to blur what others were calling a convenient blackout. The Johnson family's lawyers made it clear. They believed the footage had been edited as part of a cover-up. Local SCLC leaders and independent investigators tried to support the official version, claiming the recording gaps weren't malicious. But the sense of wrongdoing lingered. If this really was just an accident, why were there so many failures in the footage? Why did time disappear? What happened between 1:30 p.m. and the moment Kendrick was found? The entire school seemed to suffer a technological collapse, right at the moment when the truth was most needed. The Johnson family's grief found no comfort in the official investigations. What came instead was rage. Amid their mourning, Jacqueline and Kenneth Johnson chose to fight the system. They launched protests, demanded accountability, and, backed by the NAACP, the SCLC, and activists like Al Sharpton, organized a statewide push for justice. The case was no longer just about Kendrick. It had become a symbol of racial injustice, institutional neglect, and judicial silence. Legal action began with a request for a new investigation, which local authorities ignored. Then came lawsuits. The family filed a wrongful death suit against the school district, claiming Kendrick had been violently attacked at school, and that officials failed to protect his right to life. The suit referenced past incidents of racial harassment, ones that had been formally reported but ignored. In January 2015, the Johnsons took it further. They filed a $100 million civil suit against 38 individuals, including classmates, FBI agents, school staff, coroners, and local officials. The charge? Conspiracy to cover up a murder. The lawsuit specifically named brothers Brian and Brandon Bell, the sons of an FBI agent, accusing them of direct involvement in Kendrick's death. The accusation was explosive, but the impact wasn't only legal. Outlets like Ebony magazine published articles that, despite using aliases, clearly pointed to those involved. This led to new lawsuits, this time targeting the media. Meanwhile, every local judge recused themselves from the case, citing close connections to the defendants. The Johnsons' battle for justice was increasingly surrounded by invisible walls and powerful interests. Still, the movement kept growing. Marches, vigils, and protests took over Georgia's streets. Kendrick's face appeared on posters, t-shirts, banners. His death, once buried by officials, had become a rallying cry for answers. But as public pressure grew, the system fought back harder, and the Johnsons' fight for justice slowly transformed into a war for survival. Time went on. The marches continued. But behind the scenes, the Kendrick Johnson case was trapped in a legal maze. In October 2013, then U.S. Attorney Michael Moore of the Middle District of Georgia announced a formal review of the case. It felt like a ray of hope, but that light quickly faded. In 2015, Moore stepped down. The case was transferred to Ohio, where the new prosecutor, Stephen Dettelbach, also resigned shortly afterward. The federal investigation quietly slipped into a coma. Meanwhile, the Johnsons made a strategic and emotionally devastating decision. They withdrew their $100 million lawsuit, hoping they could reopen it later. But the system struck back. They were sued for defamation and ordered to pay over $800,000 in attorney's fees, plus more than $1 million in damages. In 2017, Judge Richard Porter ruled that the family had fabricated evidence and made baseless claims, ordering them to pay $292,000 to the defendants. By then, public opinion was split. On one side, people saw the Johnsons' fight as a legitimate battle against a broken system. On the other, some believed the case had been blown out of proportion by baseless theories. Frustration hit its peak. Everyone wanted clear answers, but every legal body passed the responsibility to the next, and time, cruel as ever, kept slipping by. Then, on June 20, 2016, the United States Department of Justice issued its final ruling. No criminal charges would be filed. The reason? A lack of conclusive evidence that Kendrick's civil rights had been violated. The same system that failed to preserve the crime scene was now officially closing the case. The word accident once again haunted the halls of Lowndes High School. But the story didn't end there. In March 2021, Sheriff Ashley Polk reopened the case and personally offered a $500,000 reward for any information that could lead to a conviction. A bold move. For 13 months, he and his team re-examined every piece of evidence. Then, in January 2022, came the final verdict. No homicide, no cover-up, no conspiracy, just a tragic, bizarre accident. For Kendrick's parents, the wound was reopened and once again left to bleed. When Kendrick Johnson's body was first discovered, it barely made the headlines. Just another death labeled an accident. But as details began to surface, the second autopsy, the organs replaced with newspaper, the missing footage, the case ignited a wave of national outrage. From local outlets to CNN, Kendrick's name began to spread, heavy with pain and confusion. Images of the gym, the devastated faces of his parents, the cold tone of the official reports, all of it started gaining traction on social media. Hashtags like "Justice for Kendrick Johnson" trended daily, and the more people learned about the case, the more they came to the same chilling conclusion. Something wasn't right. People wanted answers, but all they got was silence. Major news outlets produced special reports, trying to reconstruct the timeline. CNN even aired a documentary featuring the surveillance footage, showing the missing time gaps and the last moment Kendrick was seen alive. But even that drew criticism. Some claimed the media wasn't investigating. They were simply repeating the official version. The case had become a battleground of narratives and conflicting interests. But the deepest impact wasn't on the news. It was in the quiet conversations, in school hallways, in Black households across the country. Many parents began fearing even more for their children's safety. Kendrick Johnson had become the symbol of an old fear, dying without justice. His death filled with unanswered questions, connected to a much larger story, one of racial injustice and unequal treatment in the U.S. legal system. To those who believe Kendrick was murdered, the media didn't do enough. To those who believe in the accident theory, the exposure was too much. But one thing is certain: Kendrick Johnson's name will never be forgotten. Because when newspaper was stuffed into the space where his organs once were, that emptiness was felt by an entire generation still asking the same question: why has no one been held accountable? From the beginning, the official version of Kendrick Johnson's death sounded implausible. A strong, athletic teenager suffocating inside a gym mat. No screams, no witnesses, no footage. It was too easy, too quick. And soon, alternative theories began to emerge, some based on evidence, others on distrust, but all fueled by one shared belief: Kendrick didn't just fall in there by accident. The main theory points to brothers Brian and Brandon Bell, the sons of an FBI agent. According to the Johnsons' lawsuit, Kendrick had a physical altercation with Brian about a year before his death. Unverified sources, like anonymous emails sent to the sheriff's office, claimed the brothers ambushed Kendrick in the gym, and that the assault was covered up with help from their powerful father. The allegations included murder, destruction of evidence, and crime scene manipulation. Other theories mention racially charged fights being ignored by school administrators, alleged reports of bullying, shoving in hallways, constant provocation, all dismissed. According to the family, the school had a history of turning a blind eye to conflicts between black and white students. That opened the door to suspicions that Kendrick's death was the result of months of silent tension boiling over. Some even questioned the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Why did the GBI release a body with missing organs? Why were the bloody shoes and backpack ignored? Why did the cameras conveniently fail during the most critical moments? These questions piled up like bricks, and the feeling that someone was pulling strings behind the scenes only grew with each official silence. Those who believe in the conspiracy are clear: Kendrick was murdered, and powerful people are involved. Skeptics argue there's no solid evidence, and that the murder theory was driven only by a grieving family's pain. But like every great mystery, this one thrives in uncertainty, and as long as the gaps remain open, the whisper of conspiracy will continue to echo through every dusty file. Time went on, but for Jacqueline and Kenneth Johnson, the wound never healed. In 2018, 5 years after burying their son, they made the agonizing decision to exhume Kendrick's body again. It was like opening the coffin of their pain once more, but they believed the truth was still there, buried under layers of silence, in the gaps between reports, maybe even in Kendrick's own bones. On June 22, 2018, with permission from the city of Valdosta, Kendrick's body was removed from his grave. For the third time, it underwent forensic analysis. The hope that new techniques or fresh eyes might reveal what previous exams had missed, and finally identify a cause of death that matched the physical evidence, not just the police's convenient story. The exhumation reignited national debate. TV shows covered the case again. Civil rights groups ramped up their campaigns. But despite the new examination, no explosive revelations came to light. The pain of waiting stretched on, as if every new effort by the family was met with a system growing even more resistant. It felt like every step toward truth was met by someone erasing the trail. Still, the Johnsons pushed forward. They filed a complaint against the funeral home that handled Kendrick's body, accusing them of unethical practices and disrespecting the dignity of the deceased. The state's investigation concluded that while stuffing the body with newspaper wasn't ideal, no laws had been broken. Once again, technically, no one was guilty. Once again, outrage was buried beneath cold reports. That exhumation may have been the final physical act in a journey that had already become spiritual. Kendrick had been buried 3 times, none of them in peace, and his parents, who had lost a son, now seemed to be losing hope. Not because they gave up, but because they realized the system was determined to bury the case, far deeper than any grave could ever go. Kendrick Johnson's death wasn't just a tragic event. Over the years, it became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when justice, truth, and power meet in silence. For many young black people in the United States, Kendrick's name is no longer just part of a headline. It became a reflection, a warning, a reminder that impunity still walks free, even in the hallways of our schools. Musicians, activists, and filmmakers began referencing the case in their work. Kendrick became a lyric in protest rap, a topic in podcasts about racial inequality, a theme in independent documentaries. In classrooms, his name started coming up in discussions about privilege, institutional neglect, and selective justice. His parents' fight inspired movements calling for body cams, forensic transparency, and updated protocols in suspicious death cases. The town of Valdosta, once relatively unknown outside Georgia, is now marked by this haunting. Some people look away. Some still say it was just an accident. But in the streets, especially in the communities on the margins, Kendrick Johnson's name is spoken with both respect and rage. For those who know his story, he represents a generation lost not just to violence, but to a system that chose to turn its back. His mother, Jacqueline, remains active to this day, attending vigils, giving interviews, marching in protest. His father, Kenneth, continues to say he'll never stop, because for them, the fight is not just for Kendrick, it's for every young person who might be silenced the same way. Their son's face appears on posters that read, "Justice for Kendrick." But what's really at stake is justice for an entire generation. Even without convictions, without arrests, and without an officially accepted truth, Kendrick Johnson's legacy lives on. He's a living memory that makes people uncomfortable, and maybe that's exactly why it matters. Because as long as his name is remembered, the case stays alive. And maybe, one day, someone will finally tell the full truth about what really happened in that old gym. In March 2021, 8 years after Kendrick Johnson's death, Sheriff Ashley Polk officially reopened the case. The announcement sparked surprise, hope, and skepticism. Polk, a veteran of local law enforcement, said he would review over 10,000 pages of documents, footage, and reports. For many, this seemed like it could be a turning point, a new set of eyes, finally, on a story tainted from the very beginning. But Polk didn't just take on the case. He offered a $500,000 reward from his own pocket for any information that would lead to an arrest in Kendrick's death. A bold move, a direct challenge to the silence that surrounded the case. For 13 months, his team reanalyzed evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and combed through inconsistencies. But what promised to be a turning point ended in yet another disappointment. In January 2022, Polk gave his conclusion. No homicide, no conspiracy, no cover-up. In his words, Kendrick Johnson's death was once again a tragic and bizarre accident. He added that there had been nothing wrong with the original investigation, no criticism of how the case was handled by the police or the GBI, no further action recommended, just silence, stamped onto a final report. That conclusion reopened the family's trauma. Kenneth Johnson publicly said the report wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. Jacqueline resumed her protests, claiming the state had ignored evidence, denied justice, and protected the people involved. To them, Polk wasn't a neutral reviewer. He was just another actor in a system that protected itself at all costs. Many outside observers also questioned the process's lack of impartiality. After all, how can you trust a police system that's investigating its own failure? The absence of an active federal probe, the resignation of prosecutors, the recusal of local judges, and the lack of convictions all reveal what some call a structure of institutional impunity. The Kendrick Johnson case, officially closed, remains for thousands living proof that justice can be selective. Kendrick Johnson's body was buried 3 times, but the truth about his death never found a place to rest. What began as an unexplained accident quickly unraveled into a maze of failures, omissions, and contradictions. Missing footage, untested blood, vanished organs, and a school that never had to answer for anything. Was it chance or convenience? His family was mocked, sued, and ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars just for trying to understand what happened to their son. They never asked for revenge. They asked for answers, and were crushed by the weight of a system that, instead of protecting them, protected Bate itself. Because when justice fails its most basic duty, mourning turns into resistance. Kendrick Johnson walked into a gym alive at 1:28 p.m. He never walked out. No camera saw him. No witness spoke. No authority acted with urgency. Since then, all that's left are cold reports, stacked files, and empty promises. But for his mother, Jacqueline, and his father, Kenneth, time stopped in that moment. And every day since has been nothing but an echo. Maybe we'll never know what really happened inside that gym mat. Maybe someone out there is still too afraid to speak. But one question remains, uneasy, unanswered, buried under the concrete of official versions. When someone stays silent, who are they protecting? Because if Kendrick really died by accident, why does everyone act like they have something to hide? If you've watched this far, drop a comment below. Kendrick Johnson deserves justice. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Here, we tell the stories others try to bury. See you in the next case.